Alright everyone, so I'm going to make a video here that kind of puts the three PowerPoints that you have together. So when you're looking at the modes that we're talking about and blending these modes, the first one we're going to talk about is description. So description basically adds the detail for a topic. So it's what your reader sees. When you read a really boring story, you can't see it in your head. When you read a really good descriptive story, you can. So you often put these together with other modes. So each mode, descriptive, narrative, or other, has its own formula, essentially, for a thesis statement, which is your statement that says, this is what I'm writing about. So the thesis formula for this is the thing being described plus the impression that you're trying to give about that thing. And you're trying to describe it for your audience. So if you are talking to an audience of children, you're going to talk differently than you would to an audience of millennials, or to an audience of women versus men. There's a lot of different sort of variations based on audience. So here's some example thesis statements. So we have the thing being described and we have the impression. So the nursing home is depressing. The amusement parks are thrilling. The weight room is intimidating. The beach is relaxing. So the dominant impression is the feeling, the mood, or the atmosphere of the topic. It's the emotion. So if you go and describe a haunted house, you're not going to describe it as a fun, light, happy place. It's going to be something moody or spooky or depressing. It's how we make sense of the environment, in other words. So the dominant impression is that mood that we get from the text. So if you read an Edgar Allan Poe story, there's a particular mood there. Versus if you read something like Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. That's a very different mood. So when you're looking at dominant impression words, you want to use ones that are really good. And I did not make this PowerPoint, so forgive the word crappy there. But good impression words are things like aggressive, chaotic, inviting, lethal, terrifying. Bad ones are things like awesome, beautiful, fun, okay, outstanding, typical, great. These are not great impression words. This should be something that makes you feel something like you've never felt before. So when I read a story when I read The Hunger Games, for example, that's a very distinct impression. It's something that's very different than, say, Twilight. So to make the impression, you can use a lot of different tools. We're going to go through them. Connotation essentially is where you use the words that you're describing for a particular intent. So denotation was the definition. Connotation is what you associate with the word. So when you say ignorant, you have something conjured in your head, an image or an idea or an understanding of what that means. When I say the word stunning, again, you have another idea or image in your head. You might think of a model, you might think of a sunset, but you don't think of the cobblestone pavement down your street. That's not stunning. So there's certain associations we make with certain words. If you look at sensory details, these are the five senses, of course. And there's different ways we describe different things with using the senses. So the smell of something can be very powerful to describe. When I talk about a spring day and I describe the way that the honeysuckles smell alluring and sweet, it's going to be a different sensory detail than something like strength or quality of the feeling or the touch. When we write with sensory details, you have to be careful what you're actually describing. So when you say, I can see the blue ocean, that's nice. But it doesn't give me that connotation or that feeling. So say the vast blue ocean shifts on the horizon, rising and falling. That's a much, much better sentence. When you're adding details, you want to make very, very specific about them. The food tasted great. Well, that's great. But what does the food actually taste like? Is it sweet? Is it salty? Is it gritty? Is it smooth? Is it hot, cold? There's so many different things you could describe about the taste. When we use comparative language, we want to use comparative that is like a simile. So when you use a simile, you say like or as. When you use a metaphor, we use without it. Personification is saying something has human qualities it doesn't. So the toaster spat the toast at me would be personification. When you compare, don't pick two random objects, obviously. You want to make sure that they have things to do with each other. So if you say the boy's face is as red as a tomato, that makes sense. If you say the boy's face is as green as the trees, it makes much less sense. When you're using comparisons, you want to make sure you're using active verbs. So the puppy was scared by the storm, you could say that. But the puppy is terrified by the lightning and thunder banging outside the window is a much stronger way of phrasing that. So a way to fix boring sentences. She had hair. And you can look at these examples for yourself. But it's a good idea to kind of do a pass through your narrative to make sure that you're really getting the most out of the description that you can. So when you do organization, there's 3 ways you can organize it. Spatial organization is making sure that we are looking at a particular vantage point, so by location. So if I'm talking about a story in Paris, I'm going to center it on Paris. If I'm doing chronological, I'm telling a story in a numeric order. So first this happened, then this happened, then this happened. An emphatic organization puts the reasons on order of importance. So something like a Poe story would do is where it talks about the fall of the House of Usher, where we start at the beginning of talking about Usher, and then we go in and we go into the house and see what's going on, and we come back out at the end. So we're going to integrate with other modes. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But it's very important to really understand how modes work. So the next one is I'm going to work on narrative modes. Really quickly pull this up here for you. Narrative modes are really a way of telling a story. So it can be the act or the person telling the story. But remember that you want to make it concise and have a point. Again, I go back to Poe. Poe is very, very good at this. He can tell a short story in a matter of pages. Hemingway can do the same thing, a matter of pages, or 1 page even, and tell a succinct story. So the thesis for a narrative is the experience and the lesson learned. So, for example, skydiving was scary, but I overcame my fear of heights. That is the experience and the lesson learned, all in 1 sentence. So thesis statements can come in 2 types, implied or stated. So the stated thesis follows a formula that's very clear. An implied thesis may not say exactly what the lesson learned was, or may not say exactly what the experience was, but it still implies meaning. It's much more nuanced and much more difficult to use, so usually we start out with looking at stated thesis statements. Usually, for a narrative, it's still going to be in the introduction somewhere. Sometimes it's at the end, but usually introduction. So if you're going to tell a story, it's best often to put it into chronological order, but there are exceptions. Flashbacks, of course, take us back in time to an event that happened prior to what you're talking about now. That has something to do with the setup or the characters. Foreshadowing, of course, goes the opposite way, hints at what's to come. So these are really good tools for making it very suspenseful, or adding information to a story without being too direct. So there's a lot of different stories. This is the classic story arc. So you really have the exposition, which is where everything gets set up, and then you have the rising action. Eventually you have the climax where everything kind of comes to a head. You have the falling action where things start getting put back together, and the denouement is, or the resolution is where the ending of the story occurs. Just because it's a resolution doesn't mean everything actually fits together perfectly. It's not like every story has a happy ending. It's just where everything kind of comes to an end. There are a few different elements you want to think about when you do narration. So character, of course, are the people in your story. The setting is the time and place. The plot is what's happening, the sequence of events. The conflict is what must be resolved. So this is the traditional man versus nature, etc., etc. And the theme, the overarching ideal, moral, or main point or message of the story. So dialogue is equally important. Dialogue it doesn't always get used in every narration, but it is very important because it helps add to characterization. So if you look at, say, a Hemingway story, say Hills Like White Elephants, you'll see that the entire narrative is almost pure dialogue. There's very little exposition or explanation of what is happening. You have to piece it together yourself. And the dialogue really should mirror the language of the characters. So it doesn't need to be formal. It doesn't need to be colloquial. It can be normal language. Use language that is familiar. And then when you look at point of view, of course, you know first person, which is using I. Second person, which uses you, which doesn't often get used too much. It's far less used than first or third person, and third person is the most common. So it's the he walked down the street, he had this thought. Third person omniscient would be where you can see into the character's mindset, and third person limited omniscient is where you cannot. So if you know he was feeling anxious and nervous, that's third person omniscient. Narratives, of course, just like the other ones, can be standalone or it can be blended with the other modes. Usually you will blend it with other modes. With narratives, you want to watch verb tense. So again, you do have to tell a story in past tense, but you want to try and make it as active as possible still. It's really important. All right, last one. Process mode. So the process analysis, let me get this open for you, explains how to do something or how something works. So really there's a how-to. This is the usual, like how do I make a sandwich? How do I change a tire? How something works. How do you win a Nobel Prize? How do you create a new law? Or you can have the process thesis statement. So the process thesis statement really has two parts. It's why the process is significant and what it is. So why should you have to learn it, or why is it important? So example, the example sentence could be why teenagers should know how to change their oil, or why winning the Nobel Prize changes your life. The organization depends on what you're trying to achieve, but usually it's chronological. You start with this, then you do this, then you do this. You have to think about the order or it won't work correctly. So if you go out of order about how to bake a cake and you start with icing the cake and then you go back and say add the eggs, it's not going to work. An emphatic order can be possible. It's just far less used. So key features, background information. You have to give the background information for your audience. So why should they care and how does it fit with their qualifications or their understanding? Make sure your steps are very, very clear. Make sure your equipment or the parts involved are very clear. Define any technical terms that are needed because maybe your audience is not familiar with them. Make sure you give enough detail to clearly explain how to do each step because your audience is not going to necessarily know how to do this. And if they're reading it on a page, it needs to be very, very clear. And this is where description comes in quite often. And then anticipate problems. Anything that could go wrong, you need to anticipate that for your reader. If you have an essay where you need a process but it's not the main focus, look at the summary or the overview of the process and then make sure it's clear why it's included. And then help people understand this is a process or a procedure that is necessary for understanding X, Y, or Z. And then when you're done, make sure to let them know the transition back into the primary mode. So the point of view can be first person, so how I learned to drive a bus. Second person, first unscrew the jar. Or third person. Librarians often go into the back to find the book. That's third person. So it can be any of those ways. You actually don't have to announce in the thesis, I'm going to do the second step now. I'm going to do the third step. Just make it implied. So the first step is X. The second step is X. Make sure you explain how to do each step. And I've given you some examples here that you can look at to kind of explain how to take a very simple sentence and make it far more involved. And explain why. That's really important too. I hate when people tell me to do something I don't understand why. Make sure you're explaining to your audience why they're doing something while they're doing it. And that's pretty much it for the processes or for the modes. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, go on to your next assignment.